Welcome to everybody to the webinar, our CSAC research seminar this week on Wednesday. I'm Colin Call. I'm the social science co-director at CSAC, and today we are pleased to welcome Christian Davenport. Christian is a professor of political science and faculty associate at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, my alma mater. So it's great to have another Wolverine on the screen. He's also a research professor at PRIO, the Peace Research Institute Oslo, and an elected fellow at the American Association for Arts and Sciences. His primary research interests include political conflict, measurement, racism, and popular culture. He is the author of 7 books and numerous articles appearing in the top journals in the field. And he's the recipient of a bunch of grants and awards. And today, Christian's going to talk to us about stopping state repression, an inquiry into spells. And I have to tell you, when I first saw the title, Christian, I was hoping there might be some magic involved because of the word spells. But after reading your abstract and looking over your paper, alas, I believe the only magic we'll be exposed to is your top-notch scholarship. So with that, our format for today is that Professor Davenport will go through his presentation. I will then moderate the Q&A. You can enter your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I will go through them in the order that they are received at the end. So without further ado, Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I thought you were going to make a reference to kind of Zen and Yard motorcycle maintenance and inquiry into that's kind of where it was coming from.
That'd be a good one too.
Thank you very much for inviting me in. I'm going to talk a little bit about this paper under review. I think everyone's got hit with COVID review-itis, but dealing with that. And this is a part of a larger manuscript, which is also delayed, but moving forward anyway with Benjamin Apple. And it largely for us starts with the problem that is state behavior, which is violent, widespread, and systematic. Acknowledging that it's not a problem for everybody, but we're going to acknowledge that it is a problem for many individuals on the planet. And also that there's different aspects of the problem that people generally tend to concern themselves with, right? So some concern themselves with prevention, others concern themselves with punishment and reconciliation, and I'm concerning myself with termination. So how do we stop something that is already underway? Partly it's the pessimist in me, which is kind of like, all right, we might not be able to stop it ahead of time, a lot of political will issues, but when something's up and running, how do we stop it? In line with that, there's diverse documents and diverse organizations that view this as being something that is similarly of importance to them. And thus, I feel as if we're directly speaking to an interest that exists within the world of things that people would like to know. Interestingly enough, we have various institutions and individuals and scholars and scholarly traditions that are kind of focused on specific type of resolutions to this problem. So there's a group of scholars who are specifically interested in the topic of economic sanctions, some, such as myself, like democracy, democratization, others military intervention, some naming and shaming, others international law. It's on the one hand a vibrant community to see so many different resolutions being thrown at this particular problem, but I'll actually identify this as being somewhat of a limitation, as many individuals tend to focus on their own specific solution, policy, independent variable, and they give short shrift to others. So what stops large-scale state repression? It's exciting, but at the same time frustrating to realize that after 50 years of detailed quantitative evaluations of this topic, we don't really know what works. And thus we find ourselves in a very awkward situation as we're trying to figure out how to resolve these problems. The limitations with regards to why we don't know. Part of it is we've been focused on variation. And actually, let me say in all honesty, I have been part of the problem. I have been one of these individuals promoting and developing this particular area of research. So I very much look at this as being, I'm indicting myself, and I'm trying to come up with a resolution to the problem that I helped start and continue. But a large number of us have been interested in variation in state repressive activities and not the termination of. And interestingly enough, in our conversations of variation, we tend to highlight the idea of reduction. quite frequently. So I think there is an element of the research that is expressly interested in the idea of termination, but we haven't quite made that conceptual pivot to get to that particular point. Related to something I was saying before, in this particular area, one of the limitations has been folks either focusing on domestic interventions, domestic policies, independent variables, or they're focusing in on international ones, and those emerging from some other nation state intervening into yours. And if there is a discussion of both simultaneously, it's unfortunate that the author is basically tipping their hand by doing the most rigorous work on their particular variable of interest, and they give light coverage to the other. And by I mean light coverage, I mean they might not be using the most up-to-date operationalization, or they might not be paying attention to nonlinearities or the best functional form that's come out in the literature. And theoretically, there's also kind of a limit in the sense that I'd argue that there's a presumed easy shift in state repression. And so there's the decision calculus, which I'll discuss in a second, but effectively we've been all looking for the right cost, and what's the factor, what's the variable that we can impose on a particular political leader that would prompt them to kind of like move out of being in repression mode and move to some other situation. A close example could be Conrad and Moore. They explicitly focus on termination of torture spells. One of the only analyses, there's only like 2 or 3 on this topic. They're interested principally in diverse domestic factors, different manifestations of democracy, veto and voice, civil law, freedom of the press. They're only interested in one international factor, so kind of giving an example of the thing that I was mentioning before, naming and shaming, and a light rationalist kind of like argumentation exists there. Their principal finding is that domestic factors do matter. The democratic factors weigh a great deal, but they're undermined or overwhelmed by civil conflict. In those contexts, the democratic elements don't work, and thus torture is likely to be there. But my piece today is different from this work in the sense that this work is not interested in large-scale state repression. I'm interested in large-scale state repression. Theirs was quite ubiquitous in many respects, as so many individuals use torture at a low level. And also the study was not necessarily comprehensive across a wide variety of interventions and independent variables and policies that people actually care about. Conventional research, as I was mentioning before, is adopting this perspective where there's a repression decision calculus, right? So political authorities are evaluating the costs and benefits of engaging in that particular action, and clearly costs generally are more important in these theoretical constructs, and thus the studies themselves. And after the calculus is conducted, a decision is made, and a policy is implemented. And this process, interestingly enough, this process is constantly updated, or the belief is that this process, this evaluation is happening all the time. So if you can introduce the right cost and in this cycle of decision making, that you could basically disrupt and shift the behavior that you're interested in. So I want to push back against that conceptually and do this lightly within the article. You can only do so much, but in the book, it's clearly laid out a lot more. This idea of the repressive Leviathan, especially for large scale state repression. The point is that it's not a simple process. Rather, it involves thousands or tens of thousands of people and actions that are distributed and allocated across space and time. So it's this immense thing that we're thinking about as we're trying to contemplate the relevant phenomena. So harking back to the Hobbesian book cover that I think we all like, but thinking about the decision calculus is implemented by these principles. They cast forth their policy to be implemented by different security force agents who, as the agents of that principle, engage in the repressive behavior towards various groups and individuals, those being the black arrows toward the bottom of the figure. I'll return back to this later, actually. So I want to suggest a kind of conceptual pivot where we're moving from Leviathan to Juggernaut. We're moving from this large entity of all these individuals and all these actions taking place. And the reason for doing that shift conceptually is that in my idea, once repression is underway, it's hard to stop. To change it, you're going to have a dramatic shock to this particular process. In my conception, authorities do not update the calculus as frequently as existing literature suggests. Rather, they lock in, practicing what I refer to as commitment escalation. And in these situations, individuals come to make a particular evaluation of a situation. They then stick to that policy. They stick to one another, the individuals, the cohort that were there for that policy. They have an emotional attachment to that particular policy and they wish to maintain it over time. Additionally, I wish to make the point that I think domestic factors are more important than international ones generally, given the dynamics of how repressive policies are often created as well as implemented. And so from this particular piece of research, democratization serves as the major disruption to the repressive practice that we believe is going to have the greatest impact with regards to what's going on. And largely that's because we expect that democratization brings in new people into government and new connections or new relationships that can be established with constituents and a possibility of developing a new form of political legitimacy that doesn't involve violence, but involves some other mechanism of communication and mechanisms of power. To test this argument, we developed a repression spell database. There is no database on repression spells. And so we created this. And so a spell is a sequence of years of repression above a particular threshold. And the threshold for us concerns that we use the political terror scale and identify that 3 and above is within a spell of large scale state repression. And below that is not. From that categorization, we ended with 239 spells, 132 terminations. This level 3 cutoff is extremely important in many respects because above that level, we see that the intensity, scope, violence, and even the political reasoning behind the authorities is fundamentally different from the lower levels. The conception isn't necessarily tied to political terror scale. I've now looked at this basic idea of inspired by the Civil War and interstate war literatures. In the beginning, they all started with their lists. And so fundamentally, I've basically taken every repression and human rights database and both cross-national and national and compared it to what we derive with regards to our listing and see a significant amount of stability with it. So for example, we have Rwanda that has a block from 1990 to 2004. Interestingly, there's a regime change in there, so that becomes useful. Spain has a couple of years in the beginning, a couple of years at the end of the time period that we're interested in, 76 to 2007. Recall that Syria is in a spell throughout the time period. Notice the level of the spell might vary. Well, in an attempt to be as comprehensive as possible and as respectful actually to this literature as one could imagine, we attempted to basically identify the best measure that individuals had developed and the best functional specification from each of these areas of the repression literature. As I mentioned, some folks are concerned with democratization, others economic sanctions, military interventions, naming and shaming, international law, preferential trade agreements. And so we've grabbed the best variables that were available there and while controlling for what we believe to be the most robust model from this 50-year literature. Semi-parametric Cox proportional hazards estimation is used, fairly straightforward with regards to that. Results in hazard ratios, we're doing this to make things as communicable as possible to the widest audience. It's like there's no paper without a punchline. Our punchline is that democratization does terminate spells. We're going to spend a bunch of time up here kind of like not only just going over that, but also contextualizing the findings a little bit to let you know kind of like why we feel a little bit comfortable with this and also where I'm going with this subsequently. Related to the democratization terminate spells finding, we find no international variables influence spell termination. That's no international variables influence spell termination. In fact, economic sanctions make things worse. This is the survival function that you get out of these types of analyses that shows the difference from having democratization to not having democratization. Well, some other findings emerged from the study which are incredibly important for us to highlight. Civil conflict population youth bulges, for example, they prolong spells. Civil war termination and independent judiciary tends to shorten spell. Level of democracy, economic development, and civil resistance have no effect whatsoever. The last one is especially important because in a way to try to unpack exactly, well, where's democratization coming from? Maybe that's not satisfying for individuals to just have democratization leading to termination. We actually show that civil resistance that leads to democratization leads to the termination. And so pulling back that causal chain a bit became incredibly useful to do. So the study is very much interested with many ideas regarding the robustness of our findings and thinking about trying to understand what limitations might exist with what we've done. There's a discussion of indigeneity and investigations of it that are in the paper that I provided. We also wanted to address this idea of onset in many respects. A limitation with regards to most studies of conflict is that it tends to focus on a particular dimension. So there's literatures on escalation, onset, termination, duration, recurrence. Effectively, we need to investigate all of these, and part of this effort is to identify that our causal determinants might vary across which phase of a life. I don't really like repression life cycle, maybe repressive life or death cycle. I'm not quite sure how to modify that yet. But the idea is to run our analyses across each of these dimensions to determine whether or not we're getting distinct findings. And so within the paper, highlight onset. And no internationally oriented variables have an impact on onset. The likelihood of onset taking place is limited by regime durability, independent judiciary, and level of democracy, but not democratization. The likelihood of an onset of a large-scale state repressive spell is enhanced by civil war, youth bulges, low GDP, and high population. So one might wonder whether or not we're dealing with a particular phenomena that's different as a function of how long the spell goes on. Do we see some interaction effects with regards to what's taking place? So we find international variables are not significant, regardless of whether or not we're looking at long or short spells, but democratization has a stronger impact for longer spells, which really kind of like plays out this argument a little bit about the kind of repressive cohort and what's needed to shock that. Related, it becomes interesting, right? Is the finding driven in many respects by this cohort dynamic, or are there other aspects of change that we might consider? So removal of leader does not have any influence on spell termination. Irregular transfers of power like coups or revolutions don't have effect on spell termination. Other operationalizations of democracy also can reveal democratization reveal a similar type of finding. One might also wonder, is everything really driven by civil war, or we're talking about large-scale state repression is really derivative of this other phenomena? And no, the influence of democratization does not appear to be conditional upon what happens with regards to civil war. And so we feel that the robustness of the findings across these are very important. Now, while getting to implications, there's still a little bit to go. So sorry if I'm making you think that I'm about to wrap up. But the implications of the work, I believe, are quite substantive. For researchers, we need a fundamental shifting away from the different aspects of repression that we've been paying attention to look at repressive spells more explicitly. We also need to unpack the democratization effect and identify which actors are for and against the spell, kind of breaking back into this idea of this repressive cohort and the coalition. And in a sense, really kind of getting to an unpacking of exactly who the individuals are that are associated with the different manifestations of support for the different policies that could emerge. We also need to think regarding policymakers, advocates, and activists. And here's where I frequently get into some kind of trouble in many respects, because I think we need to stop discussing and implementing economic sanctions, military intervention, naming and shaming, and legal as well as trade agreements, at least on their own. We need to think about and revisit these older conversations we had about prevention. Try not to get into this in the first place, but once we're in the context of a large scale repressive spell, we need to renew these ideas about democratization and its connections to civil resistance. I think that's an important implication that emerges. Now, in many respects, this research is an ongoing piece. This is part of a trilogy that I'm developing as it relates to this topic. And as I'm going about this larger research agenda, I'm doing many things that I think are related to this paper. One is I'm validating the spell list against every source and historical monograph and expert survey I can identify. This is underway currently. I'm developing detailed case explorations of all spells, and this is to kind of lay out exactly what the sequence of events are. So in Albania, 76 to 2002, one of the spells, We see nonviolent direct action, which leads to democratization, which leads to subsequent spell termination. And so this is exactly what it is that I theorize is going to happen. But at the same time, it's useful to see because there's other types of sequences, right? So Bolivia gives us a little bit of nonviolent direct action, some early democratization, back to nonviolent direct action, then democratization, then spell termination. South Korea gives us a little bit of nonviolent direct action, a longish delay of sorts, more nonviolent direct action, democratization, spell termination. But this isn't the only path, right? So Nicaragua gives us violent direct action with some nonviolent direct action, which leads to democratization, which then much later leads to spell termination. And so I need to allow for those types of time varying effects and pay strong attention to the variation that exists within the cases themselves. Sorry, Prezi occasionally has a life of its own, but that's what kind of the whole thing looks like. I'm also examining the study by spell level. So does it matter if a spell is stably at 3, stably at 4, stably at 5 with regards to the robustness of the findings? And it turns out that that's not the case, but that was interesting nevertheless to look at. A second kind of like wave of analyses that I'm conducting concerns looking at so partly Ben and myself get into this particular study because I really believe that domestic politics mattered and he really believed international politics followed. And so we kind of like went at it, but empirically. And rather than just kind of eliminate the fact that international factors play no role, we're now looking at interactions between the two as well as sequences of things that might take place over time that might have an influence. Also trying to explore the effects of repression, the repression life cycle itself. So the idea is, in a sense, do different types of onset lead to different types of escalation, which then facilitate distinct forms of magnitude, different processes of de-escalation, durations, termination, recurrence, and so forth. And to identify as there particular trajectories or sequences of repressive life cycles that should be the thing that we're analyzing and not the way that I've kind of parsed it here. And also dig more deeply into this idea of a cohort in order to identify exactly which individuals within the political, economic, and social cultural systems are engaged with supporting a particular policy or challenging it or trying to offer up something else as a solution. There's that part in Apocalypse Now where the lead character talks about first he broke away from them and then he broke away from himself. Well, this is my break away from myself moment in a sense. There's an explanation that exists for state repression that hasn't really been examined before, which is now something that I wish to explore, which is maybe repression ends because authorities are finished doing what they're trying to set out to do. But in order to figure that out, I need to figure out what it is authorities are trying to do and then to measure that. And that's what I've been kind of grappling with for the past few years. But in order to get there, I needed to develop some perpetrator target specific types of data. Also allowing for the fact that there might be specific forms of perpetrator target specific results. So that becomes incredibly useful to think about. Is that, does it really matter which perpetrator is going after which target as it relates to which type of influence or what type of factor might actually influence that specific application of repressive behavior? So in Repression All the Way Down, I've created a nationally aggregated repressive target data set by spell year. I'm currently around 15,000 dyadic spell years from 76 to 2016. So in Afghanistan, if you look at perpetrators along the bottom, targets along the side, you can identify that there's a distinct kind of constellation of perpetrator target dyads. And then the question is, do different variables, the different policies, the different interventions increase or decrease or have no effect whatsoever on the likelihood of a spell like this shifting? When you aggregate the cases, it becomes incredibly interesting, right? So the number of police dissident and police criminal dyads are incredible. Actually, just the whole row given the police is, I think, quite fascinating with regards to how frequent and perpetrator victim combinations is what PVC stands for. This figure has fascinated me in many respects. I also coded information regarding guerrillas as human rights violators, which is something that is somewhat contentious, but you see that they engage in human rights violations quite frequently. This was coded from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and State Department country reports. One might be interested in which combinations are the most lethal. This does not completely overlap with the most frequent, and so there's a distinction between them, but you can identify that there's some distinct police violence, the military engages in violence, and then quite frankly, some unstated agents that we don't identify are quite violent, occasionally against people that are sometimes and sometimes not identified. I'll stop there in many respects because I'm sure that's a lot. I apologize for being incredibly excited. I can't apologize by being excited about my topic area, but thank you very much for having an opportunity to talk about my work, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Christian, that's awesome. We already have a couple questions in the queue, so I will read them off and who they're from. For those who want to submit questions, you can do so at the Q&A button at the bottom. So the first question comes from our CSAC colleague, Gabrielle Hecht. Gabrielle writes, fascinating conclusions from the research, thinking specifically of your conclusion that democratization, not international variables like sanctions, terminates spells. Can you speak to how these conclusions play out in the case of Spain in the 2000s, which you mentioned on one of your slides, as well as South Africa under apartheid, if you can speak to that? And then she concludes, asking as a historian. That's like asking for a friend. So anyway, I think a little bit more on Spain and if you have any insights on South Africa.
I'll leave Spain alone. That's the domain of lab ball cells. I'll chill with that. But South Africa, I will speak to, which I think is very interesting. Actually, it's intriguing because after the end of apartheid, you would have anticipated that there would have been a dramatic sea change with regards to human rights violations. But we don't actually see that. It's not a dramatic shift as we would expect. And partly that's because of my cohort argument, right? So as you recall, Mandela doesn't clean house and just kick everybody out and then just pick ANC people. He's attempting to have this reconciliation area and basically had to rely upon some people that were there previously. And also the ANC infiltration or the ANC incorporation into the apartheid security apparatus did not take place as he thought. So there was actually more continuity than we were actually going to expect. And so I think that's the type of thing that I'm trying to explore, right? It's like which individuals are coming into power, how, if at all, is the security apparatus shifted, and how would that lead to actual changes on behavior?
Great. So next question comes from our colleague, Steve Stedman. Steve writes, great stuff. Can you explain how international actions are ineffective for stopping spells, yet civil war termination shortens spells? Where do you get civil war termination without international action? Things like mediation, peacekeeping, implementation of peace agreements, et cetera. And where you get democratization out of civil war, isn't it because of internationally assisted war termination?
So good question, Stephen. So what's interesting, right, is a lot of the civil war termination or civil war duration stuff is actually related directly to international interference. The degree to which we have international interference tends to prolong civil war, and so that becomes somewhat of a problem. Our results shows that civil war termination, it tends to shorten spells. What's interesting, however, is are those cases where the repression continues. So Rwanda becomes fascinating because you switch sides and you still have a continuity of large-scale state repression, despite the fact that you had quote-unquote civil war termination. And that kind of starts to tease out these differences that I'm trying to, in other work, I have a project called The Consequences of Contention, where I'm actually trying to move away from these fragmented conceptions we have of conflict processes and conflict behavior, right? So the thing about civil war is basically you have the state and the challenger side that are both engaging in violent behavior. State repression is just considering the state side, and then there's intermittently, occasionally, some opponent that they're going over. So the effect that the international community has on applications of state repression, which is just behavior directed from one side, and which effects it has on the dual joint consideration of both governments and challengers going at one another, we'd expect them to be somewhat distinct, but potentially overlapping. But as it relates back to your kind of comment about like, how do we get to civil war termination without international action? That's very useful because the mediation, the peacekeeping, the foreign aid, it's interesting, right? You paid attention to the positive aspects of international intervention. I pay attention to the other side, which is arming, training, covert operations. All these things are also taking place, which also kind of like work against or militate against some of these activities. So I think that balance needs to kind of get played out.
So the next question is actually, I think, a good segue from that. It's from Lindsay Hundley, who writes, thanks for a great talk and paper. I learned a lot. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what you think states should do to help stop spells of repression in other countries. Clearly, a lot of international policies don't work, according to your analysis, and economic sanctions make things worse. Given the findings on civil resistance, do you think it would make sense for states to invest more in transnational advocacy networks that work with local agents to affect change? So, like, is there a space for the international community to help some of the civil resistance dynamics that lead to democratization along the lines that you talk about?
So I'm definitely an R2P fan of sorts. There's a scholar, I think I want to say William Schaefer, but I'm not sure, who talks about atrocity crimes, right? Like we spend way too much time trying to ascertain exactly what form or what the motivation is behind state violence, but we should just basically try to intervene wherever we're seeing this behavior and try to figure out the particularities later. So I'm very much supportive of that. But in line with what the research was showing and clearly what I think is going on, to the degree to which we were able to support civil resistance efforts that have democratization as their end, I think that's clearly there. At the same time, I'm not kind of completely with Keck and Sikkink with regards to their advocacy for this type of thing because of a problematic aspect of the thing I hinted at, which is repression might end because the mechanisms of influence have perhaps shifted in the government's favor away from something that involves coercion and force. And so as a human rights and peace scholar, I find myself caught in the sense that I'm trying to end these large scale state repressive activities. I have no problem trying to clearly admit that. But if what I'm replacing that with is a more effective state because they're better able at to use, as Weber would suggest, a normative and material power, but the same inequalities are persisting, then I'm caught in a quandary, right? I've now eliminated the thing that I've been focused on for almost 30 years, but at the same time, I haven't necessarily helped liberate people or eliminate the inequalities that are in their life. So I'm supportive of the effort that you're suggesting. Transnational advocacy, I think, is the key that kind of emerges from this particular research, but it's made me think more about the problem of order rather than less.
Our next question comes from one of our postdocs, Melissa Carlson. Melissa writes, Christian, thank you for such an absolutely fascinating presentation. I wanted to see if you could talk a bit more about how you conceptualize democratization. Because democratization involves a wide array of policy changes and it occurs over time, how does it act as a shock to the repressive state? What factors do you think influence and/or constrain the overtime effect of democratization on the termination of repression across different countries?
Yeah, so I'm very much as many scholars that have been around for a while, I have differences of opinion with many people, right? So Beetham and myself go at it a little bit because he's got a maximalist conception of democracy and mine is very minimalist. But I tend to kind of like highlight this fact of the security force agents are the ones who most directly have control over the means of coercion. Those that are engaged in the political apparatus are the ones that are in a democracy selected by the population, but there's parties, there's other aspects of how they're influencing or dealing with one another. And so I clearly try to make that distinction between the two. So with regard to your question, I think it's useful because democratization then it's a means for non-elites to participate in the political process and get some form of representation. Now, exactly what that representation is able to do, what they conceive as being their objective or how effective they are at implementing that, that's going to vary. So that's why I find myself really much in the space of trying to ascertain what's the state project specifically? Like, what are they trying to pull off with regards to exclusion and inclusion? What are they doing with regards to maintaining or establishing economic or wealth inequality? What are those projects and how does that relate to the dynamic of governance? And so I think the way that, so I view democratization as a shock in the sense that I think it perturbs the cohort of individuals that occupy the space of governance. And now I'm trying to get at the ideas that they're trying to implement while they're in that particular space. And I realize that plays out over time, or that involves different conversations. You might be able to tap the kind of like the manifesto the Party Manifesto Project to understand exactly what someone was thinking about governance. And then if someone puts them in power, then it's believed that that manifesto will be policy. And so I find myself as a behavioralist now being very much caught with the ideas of what government is trying to pull off and the different ways that I could try to operationalize that through constitutions, through manifestos, through statements, all in the context that, you know, as a state repression person, I don't believe any government's actually going to tell you that they're going to, we want to whack 15% of the population. That's not going to happen. And so it's going to be couched in a lot of kind of like just war logic. Actually, I have a piece called Just Repression Theory, trying to kind of draw off of just war theory to think of, okay, so when is repression believed to be just? And how does that relate to what we'd expect political leaders to talk about? And so great question, but I think I'm in the process of trying to answer it better.
Yeah, it's curious how leaders like Duterte are a little bit more, there are some leaders who say the quiet out loud, but yes, in general, people don't admit it.
Only against the bad people. Yeah.
Right, the bad people. Okay, our next question comes from Professor Martha Crenshaw, who's our resident terrorism expert, and she asks, really interesting talk, Christian. Can you discuss the relationship or distinction between state terrorism and state repression? Is terrorism level 4 or higher, or something more complex?
Hi, Martha. It's like a bunch of my friends are there. So very good question. As Martha knows, because we've been in rooms where we've attempted to articulate this. So much of my pushback to much of conflict studies is that we tend to separate the state from the challenger side, but we know that terrorism and counterterrorism, revolution, counter-revolution, protest, policing, insurgency, counterinsurgency are intricately connected with the phenomena. So I believe that the state terrorism and state repression connection, which is invoking this conversation that we had like in the 80s, right? With regards to the intent of the behavior. So I'm going to arrest these people or torture these people, not to just torture them, but to influence these folks over here. And so I'm not dealing with intent, Martha. I'm attempting to basically focus on the behavior and limit that behavior without thinking through what the state is trying to do through that victimization and how that influences it. But I think there's definitely a relationship. So I would imagine that if you're trying to terrorize your society, it's definitely higher than a 2. So you're definitely in the domain of 3 to 4, but how many people you think it's necessary to terrorize this other population, that's probably going to vary as a function of how large that population is, how well connected they are. I've always thought it was interesting, Darius Rejali's work that talked about kind of like the Foucaultian move away from public displays of torture to kind of like hiding it. I've always thought it was useful in many respects. A counterweight was, well, what if you persecuted a minority, but they were the most incredibly well-covered minority that you could imagine, like African Americans in the United States. Like, you don't need to have all these different views of uses of like state coercion against different people. You could just use it against this group because it's so well publicized that everyone else would kind of come to understand the power of the state. So I think that the idea of state terror, which I don't think was really ever well operationalized, right? It's just like, because it suggests that, you know, the victimization is really secondary. What you're trying to get at is this after effect of that. And I think we were never really good about that. And some research kind of like tried to tap, you know, the fear we had maybe of Al-Qaeda, but we never really kind of got to the whole thing about how much do you fear these different state repressive tactics. I think maybe in the civil liberties area, are you concerned about like your phone being tapped? Are you concerned about being the content of your internet being kind of extracted? But we never really talked about like stop and frisk and fear about that as it related to kind of looking for insurgents or gang members. But I think that reveals like just how lucrative this area is for subsequent research.
That's fascinating. I kept thinking when you were talking about that about, you know, Al-Sisi's effort to go after the Muslim Brotherhood very publicly, but a lot of the other repression is off screen. But, you know, if you can't help if you're an average Egyptian thinking, well, if he can do this to the Brotherhood, he can do it to any of us, that type of thing. Speaking of the Middle East, Professor Lisa Blades has a question. She says, a lot of the world's worst state repression takes place in authoritarian regimes. In many cases, democratization feels unlikely to occur in these places. Is there any reason to hope for, you know, eliminating repressive spells in countries that aren't going to go down the road of democratization or not likely to?
Lisa, you're not gonna like my answer, but I think it's in this direction that I'm going. And it's funny, like I'm just rereading Ambiguities of Domination by Lisa Wadeen, right? And so there's something to be said about once states have this capacity, this non-forceful, non-coercive capacity to manipulate and control its population, then you don't need to shoot people anymore. I mean, so in many respects, I feel like I'm studying dinosaurs, right? I'm studying why have states not gotten any more effective than shooting this population in mass or arresting these people over here? Why have they not developed any other mechanisms of control? So that I think is fascinating, but it's unfortunate. But one way out of the thing that I'm studying is a non-coercive, forceful mechanism of control, normative, material, or I'm not sure where Delabate would go with regards to this, but bread and circuses, right? I mean, that's another manifestation of controlling the population. And if you can do that, then you don't need to kill them in mass. So of my hierarchy of bad things, if we can get people away from being shot, I think that's great. But my larger kind of objective of like human liberation is still upset about the fact that there's other manifestations of control that have just replaced this one.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about that in the context of the way in which states are moving, especially into forms of digital surveillance and control as a way to manipulate incentives for people to collaborate, cooperate, not rebel against the state without overt coercion. You know, China being an example, but not the only one.
Barbara Walter had had blogged about something that happened. I forget what country, if someone remembers where this was, but there was some huge protest that was going out. And what the state had done was they basically sent everyone a text indicating that they knew that they were there and that they would deal with them later. I'm just like, oh, how, 1984.
Yeah, totally. So I have one question that I think piggybacks on Lisa's a bit. So it comes from me. I wonder if your model works in reverse. As you know, we're in the midst of a 14-year democratic recession where the number of countries that are democracies is shrinking, and established democracies are slipping back into somewhere in between, and fragile democracies are slipping back. A lot of this has come because of the Putins and the Orbans and the Erdogans and the Dutertes of the world. These aren't coups, these aren't uprisings. They're essentially illiberal politicians who come to power and then chip away at the institutions and controls. So I wonder, in a world where you're kind of seeing de-democratization, does your argument work in reverse? That is, does de-democratization trigger repressive spells, or actually is that kind of a tautology, that is, de-democratization is a repressive spell? I wonder just how you think about the trends away, reversing democratic backsliding, how that relates to your model.
So I would definitely say that re-authoritarianization or de-democratization would probably ramp up the repression. We're now back in that space. But remember, my conception of democracy is really about mechanism of replacement. But what I really want to get to is an evaluation of that cohort, right? So if Mugabe's stepping down, but just his right-hand person steps in, okay, we haven't stepped outside a cohort. I think we've been really bad about. And so who's the number two in Rwanda? Who knows? And if there could be a number two identified, I'm sure they'd be disappeared. And so I'm really of the point of trying to, once we figured out those cohorts and we can track them better over time and not just pay attention to the leader, I think we'd be better off. But I definitely think that once the democratic spirit has been deteriorated, and once this idea of openness and communication and transparency and accountability has been removed, then that just sets the seed for increased and overt manifestations of repressive behavior, which is an incredible rollback to where we were, if you think in the 70s and 80s. I never have a happy story.
Yeah, right.
So it'd be good. So we still have lots of time. People that study human rights violations, state repression, will have many more cases, and that's the bad part. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. The question will be whether you also have more cases of civil resistance and things pushing the other direction, obviously.
Colin, I'm liking you all the time. Yes.
All right. We have a question from Beatrice Magaloni, and then we have space for other questions. So if other people tuning in, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. So Beatrice writes, wonderful talk and project. Where does police violence in democracies fit into your framework?
Great question, Beatrice. It fits explicitly, especially in the disaggregated project that I have, because there I'm looking at different perpetrators. And quite frankly, and I always wanted to do this, and I always forget to do it, I would have wanted to ask individuals which perpetrator or which potential perpetrator of state security force agents would they believe would be the most frequent and the most violent. And I don't know that necessarily, I think people might go along with the believing that the police would be the most ubiquitous since they're the most clear and obvious manifestation of the state. But that they'd be one of the more violent ones, I think is incredible as well. But what's interesting actually is the police civilian and police criminal dyad are some of the most frequent and the most violent, which is highly problematic in the sense of what we think, because then that gets to police discretionary power, something that we as political scientists really do not talk enough about. But it's like, how much power of a coercive and forceful nature are we willing to allow people in our midst to have against these so-called bad categories? And that sense of kind of humanity and the policy implications of that are quite powerful. But that's directly in line where the new project is going. Because I'm thinking it's like naming and shaming might work for dyads that are more overt, that are more public. But naming and shaming is probably not going to work if the security force agent is trained in private, housed alone someplace, and they engage in their form of repressive behavior against an undesirable in some location that no one can find. And so it's probably the case that we might be combining many things with regards to our different policies and not being specific enough with regards to the perpetrator and the particular target that's being targeted. But I think police violence it's the big story in my database, and one that I hadn't necessarily had an attuned interest in, aside from being an African-American and growing up with police harassment my whole life. I mean, so I'm now in the place of now looking at comparative police violence, right? And finding that to be somewhat complex as well. I don't know if anyone's seen Nicole Siegel's book, Violence Workers, but it's really interesting to kind of identify what conceptions or misconceptions we have about the difference between the military and the police and the domestic and international functions, and how in many respects they don't really exist because people are so fluid with regards to moving across these boundaries quite significantly. So I think there's a police violence story. I was actually, I was approached to write a book on police violence, which I was hesitant to initially until I saw the layout of my data, and I'm just like, oh, actually, I think my data is going to have to be a story about police violence. So thank you for mentioning that.
So, and as we wait for some other questions here, oh, good, we have a couple, good. So the next comes from Derek Darby, who writes, I'm a philosopher at Rutgers. Spells of state repression have involved voter suppression or anti-democratic tactics that make it hard for some to cast ballots or allow them to be intimidated. What's happening today in the United States is certainly not a novel example of voter suppression. Does this phenomenon negatively impact the role of democratization in terminating spells? Does it suggest that judicial oversight must go hand in hand with democratization?
Thank you very much, Derek, for the question. What's fascinating about the question is it reveals two things. One, and Dahl kind of started us on this path. It's just like any repression just seemed to be horrible for democracy because repression was so effective at having all these effects. Well, one things we know about the literature is repression has suppressive effects, but it also inspires individuals to counter. And this is more kind of Jim Scott than Dahl, right? It's an acknowledgement that the attempt at suppression is something that prompts individuals to actually want to participate even more. And so I think that's been overestimated. The second point is, Derek is very useful with regards to highlighting this distinction, right? So judicial oversight, other parts of the democracy need to kick in so that other parts of the democracy can work. And I think that is very useful. So in the article and the book, it's mostly a story about democratization of authoritarian contexts, because they're the ones who are mostly in these large scale spells. But there is a part of our data that is actually concerning, and we were pushed back on this in many respects, that shows, because we did a subset of the analysis to show exactly how spells in democracies in particular could be affected, acknowledging that they're already above this kind of Chekhov et al. Threshold. And we find that regime change of sides does have this similar type of impact with regards to ending a spell. So there is a democratization story to be told, and clearly we're living it, right? So well, we see one party has a greater sense of commitment to rights and rights protections, and another one has less. And so we would imagine that with a shift, we would see a shift in the behavior. But we're also seeing kind of like, it's the other reason why you want to disaggregate these data, right? We're seeing amazing variation across the country with regards to some locales like California seem to be ready and willing to kind of like take any means whatsoever to counter or counteract any types of initiatives that are being sent down from above. And other locations seem to be kind of rolling with it, which I think is incredibly useful. So I think we are seeing this, this dynamic interaction, but it's also revealing the complexities that repression can incite as much as it can suppress is, I think, a fascinating thing that we haven't really identified. In my Democratic Peace book, I identified that, that democracy and democratization generally tend to have a suppressive effect on state repression, unless you have civil unrest or conflict, which then gives the government license to go after you and with massive support. And so we're now seeing this confluence of these factors coming together, democratization, some unrest potentially. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I'm just like, okay, is it election? Is it a coup? Is it insurrection? Is it protest? Is it protest policing? Is it all of the above? And how does that mix actually play out? And I don't think we have many models that kind of like work that out for us. But I think Derek's question is kind of like directly there. I think that's very useful. If I may go back to Beatrice's question for a second, I missed the last part, fit into my framework. What's useful is, Beatrice, in order to kind of disrupt the police violence stuff, we need to think about city politics in a way that we don't quite frequently in the conflict literature, and think about the constellation of factors that we have at the city level that might result in democratization at the city level, and how that is like kind of underneath the gubernatorial and the national levels, but also think about what civil society organizations we have within cities to pull things off, where the police union is located, where it's strong, where it's weak. And so the question of police violence, especially in the context of the United States, for example, it forces us to disaggregate and then think about these kind of repressive cohorts, but at these different levels of analysis. Sorry, I meant to mention that before.
That's really interesting. Question from our CSAC colleague, Professor Scott Sagan. Scott asks, is there a relationship between repression and the existence of other forms of retribution, such as the death penalty?
Interesting. So the minute you say that, I think of David Garland's work, because David was really interested in trying to kind of figure out, it's like, okay, we know that punishment doesn't work, but so why do we keep punishing? And then he goes to this organizational argument. And I think that's something similar, actually, in many respects to the argument I'm laying out, because Garland's argument is that there's a coalition of individuals and institutional practices that come together that make something sticky, and they're just going to do it because that's what they do. And I think in many respects, my argument is kind of like drawing upon something similar. And so from that perspective, I think you could find these overlapping dynamics where I think the carceral state logic is kind of like, that kind of leads us in that direction, right? Where we're looking for these reinforcements. And Nicole Siegel's work definitely pulls us in that direction, because because there's a great fluidity of people coming out of the military and then they go into the police, or people that are interested in certain aspects of using coercion and force find their way into the criminal justice system. And so there's not as much difference as we would expect with regards to the personnel and the practices of these particular institutions. And interestingly enough, we tend to keep them apart, right? And so what was fascinating for me about the Floyd situation is we go from an instance of obvious, overt, individual level police violence and something that people were ready to kind of step against, and within weeks, the collective version of it, protest policing that was also deemed to be violent and incredibly excessive. And in all likelihood, these were probably the same people that were engaged in both activities. And so quite frequently, we don't make those connections, but I think real life and scholarship is pushing us in these particular directions. So thank you for that idea.
So Christian, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask you one last question. Obviously, we would love to have you here at Stanford in person. The reason we don't is because of the pandemic. And so I want to ask you a little bit about the pandemic dynamic and how it's affected your thinking about these things. So in 2019, we had more protests around the world than in any year in recent memory, and a really diverse set of countries, right? Chile, Hong Kong, Iraq, Lebanon, all over the place. Obviously, a lot of that stuff went dormant at the beginning of COVID as people were forced to go, get off the streets and go inside. You also saw states engage in a lot of repression, cracking down on journalists, on healthcare, emergency powers, canceling elections, police abuses to to enforce lockdowns, new forms of digital surveillance. Like, I don't know, I'm not coding along your lines, but it sounds like there's a lot of repression spells going on in 2020. But you're now seeing civil society push back, right? You're seeing, whether it's in Belarus or Lebanon, or in our country with the Black Lives Matter movement. So maybe a good place to conclude would just be like, in this kind of repression, civil resistance dynamic, this back and forth, how are you seeing the world right now? Are you hopeful based on your model or not so much?
So I'm hopeful that there'll be more civil resistance. I'm hopeful that there will be some accommodation of this resistance in the sense of some form of representation, and getting a seat at the table, kind of an old William Gamson type of approach. I'm not hopeful in the sense of what I believe to be the after effect of what I refer to as a demarketplace of ideas from Lindblom. I think that if you think back to the ideas we had about how we could structure society from the 1800s to like the 1960s, 1970s, we were so rich, I think, as a global society of different ideas that people had about what could be done. I think those were killed off and they were narrowed. And so the things that people are asking for and the ways they're talking about getting them, I find to be limited and not necessarily capable of resolving some of the larger issues that seem to be pressing, like how do you address the gross wealth inequality that we see? And unless you're addressing that in some way, shape, or form, a lot of the things that people are advocating for, I don't think will inevitably resolve the problems in the deepest sense. I know you tried to get me to be happy for a second, and I was partially happy.
No,
I think.
mean, look, we're at a contingent moment. I mean, honestly, the world is going to spend trillions of dollars digging itself out of the COVID hole, and they'll either do it in a way that makes inequality and corruption and these other factors less acute, or they're just going to leave the world as screwed up as it was before. So we'll have to stay tuned, I guess. Christian, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. It's super exciting. I thought the questions were great. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Definitely. Thank you very much.